Um, my name is Vincent Ragusa. I'm going to be talking about uh, how noisy evaluation of an organism's fitness relates to the selection strength in the system. And I'm going to start by giving a little bit of background and the details of the results in the A-Life paper, but then I'm also very excited to share some preliminary results from ongoing research. And I'm hoping to fit all this into 15 minutes so we can have some good questions. So just as a bit of background, if you are doing asexual evolution on deceptive landscapes, and we say, for example, our population is located here, then from a bird's eye perspective, we know that there is some potential fitness gain if only the population could move to this higher fitness peak on the fitness landscape. But this is difficult because there's a minimum beneficial distance. There's a certain number of mutations that somebody in the organism, somebody in the population has to accumulate before we can even start to detect the beneficial gain in the population. And of course, this is called, valley crossing. And valley crossing is very intertwined with the notion of selection strength, because selection is going to prevent these deleterious mutations from accumulating in the individuals in the population, and it's going to keep that population stuck here on the peak, where mutation, if they were just allowed to accumulate in the absence of selection, would simply wander via drift across this valley. So the strength of selection is fundamental to valley crossing. Now, selection strength in models of evolution tend to be parameterized by things like population size, for example. So if you have quite a small population size, then the restoring force back to the local optimum is quite weak, but also the population doesn't accumulate many mutations. So the exploration is sort of weak also. Whereas with a larger population, the selection is much stronger due to the higher sampling of the higher fitness locations, but the population is also experiencing more mutations. And so it's kind of a mixed bag in terms of adjusting selection strength. In our digital evolution systems, we can control selection strength directly. So for example, if we use the tournament selection algorithm, when we are generating our next population, we can choose a subset, put them in a tournament with each other, and we simulate competition by keeping the best of the subset. And we can continuously do this until our new population is generated. In this work, we've generalized the idea of a tournament size by allowing real valued tournaments. And the way that we interpret this is just the whole number is taken every time, and then there's some percentage to increase the tournament size by 1. And if you average across those two states, then you get some average tournament size, which can be real valued. And so we've done this to be able to adjust the selection strength with tournament size a little bit more finely. So a little bit of background to the research question. There's a lot of research going on right now that talks about how noisy evaluation of fitness can actually benefit rates of adaptation. And so I tried to sort of caricature a way of understanding how this might work. So if you have your population distributed on this fitness peak, then the fitness that the individuals have are directly given by the fitness function. But if we then add some Gaussian noise after that evaluation process, it kind of diffuses the population like this, where the lowest fitness and the highest fitness, it becomes slightly disassociated from the actual fitness function. And so selection is not able to accurately understand the topology when we add noise to the function. So that leads us to some questions. The ones that were most important to us were how does noise change the selection strength? And how does it compare to these other methods of adjusting selection strength that are a little bit more common? And the way that we went about looking at this is we have 9 fitness functions, which vary in their deceptiveness. We can change the width in terms of the number of mutations of the valley, and we can also change the depth in terms of the fitness penalty for going down into the valley. And then we combined this with a large parameter sweep of population size, tournament size, and different amounts of noise added after the evaluation on the fitness. And so let's just dive into what we find here. So we see that for very large populations, consistently across the different topologies, we find that that's the best population size to have. But for something like evaluation noise, we see that in certain cases, you can have too much noise. So the heat here on the maps are showing rates of change in units of valleys crossed. So we run the simulation and we count how many times it's able to valley cross. And so when the noise is too much, we can see that the valley crossing ceases. But in the more deceptive landscapes, we also see that without enough noise, valley crossing cannot happen. So the application of noise here is allowing valley crossing to occur where it normally could not in a noiseless environment. And we understand this as a reduction of selection strength. We also compared adjusting population size to adjusting the tournament size. And we see again that population size is pretty much always better when it's a larger population, likely due to the extra mutations that can be accumulated. But again, with tournament size, we see conditions where selection can be both too weak and too strong in order to valley cross. So there seems to be a sweet spot for selection strength here. And finally, if we look at noise and tournament size together, we can see that unlike with population size, noise and tournament size are very closely correlated with each other in the sense that increases to selection strength via tournament size have a compensatory relationship with increasing the noise as well. So in other words, if I increase the selection strength with tournament size, I can then decrease the selection strength with noise and achieve a similar like final selection strength to a different combination of those two parameters. And we can see that again, in the most deceptive landscapes, there are regions that are too strong selection and too weak selection, and that there's a sweet spot in between where the rate of valley crossing is most optimized. So just to summarize, of the 3 parameters, noise is the most similar to tournament size in the behavior, which means that noise is a rather good stand-in for selection strength. Also, noise is algorithm independent, so you can apply noise to any evolutionary algorithm, regardless of whether it's using tournament selection or lexicase or fitness proportional or anything like that. And finally, we see that every local optimum or every landscape topology has an optimum selection strength for valley crossing. So from an engineering perspective, that becomes rather interesting. And so that leads us a bit into the preliminary results, where we wanted to know in systems with multiple traits, so where fitness of the organism is the fitness on some task A and some other task B, is there an interaction between these traits that's similar to adding noise? And I sort of caricatured why we think this would be the case, because if we're adding the fitness of trait 1 to the fitness of trait 2, and the genotypes or the fitness distribution of trait 2 is distributed around some peak like this or some other distribution, it should look something like adding noise to the other trait. The caveat here is that these traits have to be independent from each other. So a lot of the multi-objective optimization literature will talk about traits that fundamentally interact in the parameter space, for example. Here we are looking at only traits that are completely independent, genetically independent, epistatically independent, and fitness independent. So the way that we wanted to go about testing this is we created a multi-trait system where organisms' total fitness is the sum of some specific traits. And the traits that we chose to use are very similar to what we saw previously, where we can increase the depth of the valley in order to increase how deceptive the landscape is. And so the easiest level of deception here would be a fitness plateau, and then a fitness gain, and then a fitness plateau. And then we can take that plateau and we can turn that into a negative slope, and we can keep turning that down and make the valley more and more deceptive. And what we're really looking for here is we're looking for the co-occurrence of valley crossing events. So how are the valley crossing events on different traits coinciding with each other? And so the very first thing that we note is the non-deceptive trait, the plateau trait, when it's evolved on its own, does quite well, but when we start adding the other traits to the system, its performance decreases, which is probably expected. However, we find that when we start with the deceptive traits, they cannot valley cross on their own at all, but then as we add traits into the system, they are actually able to valley cross more and more as we add more traits. The astute among you may have noticed that it matters which traits we add to the system. And so we did an analysis of exactly which traits are having a valley crossing event when another trait begins its valley crossing. And what we find is if we do an analysis and we compare to what we expect by random chance, we find significant increases in the co-occurrence of traits more so than chance. And we find that they're ordered in their difficulty. So they tend to be ordered by the slopes of the valleys. So for example, we find that the plateau trait crosses its, quote unquote valley. It crosses the plateau more often than chance when nothing else is going on in the system. But the medium deceptive and extremely deceptive traits go and cross their valleys 3 times more likely when the plateau trait is crossing its valley, and 6 times more likely for the really deceptive trait when both the plateau trait and the medium deceptive trait are already crossing their valleys. And just to clarify here, what I'm saying is that the more deceptive trait is 6 times more likely to valley cross when there are 2 traits crossing their valleys, but it is 2.2 times more likely to valley cross when just 2 times more likely to cross when just the plateau trait is crossing, and 1.3 times more likely to cross when just the hard trait is crossing. So there's this additive effect where the easy trait releases the medium difficulty trait. And now that they're both in action, them together have a higher chance to release the harder trait. And there's this sort of stacking effect of this. Finally, we see that as we add more traits to the system, these cross interactions between the selection strength, they grow in frequency. And we sort of named these chaining of releasing valley crossing events as cascades. So for example, the valley crossing event on trait 1 reduces the selection strength on trait 2. Trait 2 now goes into a valley crossing. Those two together have enough combined noise to release trait 3. Maybe trait 1 by now finishes its valley crossing, but now there's 2 and 3 crossing, and that releases 5. And now that there's 2, 3, and 5 crossing, that releases 6, and so on. And you can get these very long cascades of valley crossing events, which, recall, are otherwise impossible for these traits on their own. These traits are simply too deceptive for the baseline mutation rate and selection strength to cross their valley.
Vincent, can you please wrap up soonish, like in a minute or so?
Of course. So the takeaways are ostensibly independent traits can influence each other via these selection strength interactions. A second trait can modify the selection strength on another trait, similarly to the way adding noise to the evaluation can modify selection strength. And these interactions can interact in a number of ways. So I just want to say thank you. Thank you to my co-author, Clifford Bohm, and I'll be happy to take any questions.
Wonderful, Vincent. Great. Thanks for the interesting talk. And we have already questions lining up in the Q&A panel. I'll read them out. The first one by Mike. Have you investigated whether different variations in tournament size have different evolutionary outcomes? For example, does always picking size 3 tournament have consistently different results than half of the time using size 2 and the other half size 4?
Yeah, so this is a good question. So the subtle part there is that the average of 2 and 4 would be 3. So the short answer is I don't know, because the way that we've used this so far is to simply interpolate between integer sizes. So between 3 and 4, for example, we have not split the difference any further than a single integer size. But I expect that the results will be different, because tournaments of size 2 will encourage, less strict selection, and just the presence of the winners of those weaker tournaments in the population should, in general, maintain a higher diversity than you would expect from a tournament of size 3. And I don't think that the tournaments of size 4 can counter that, since they happen independently.
Great. Okay, everybody, let's thank Vincent. The keynote is starting in less than a minute.